Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. First, I'd like to do a couple housekeeping things. My name is Rachel Ramirez. I'm the curator at the Wilmette Historical Museum. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited about this program, this second virtual program. We do have a pretty big group here today. We ask you, please do not unmute yourselves. You'll come in muted. Just stay muted so that we can keep a little bit of the background noise down. We have a number of people here. We have almost 200 participants. So please, everyone, stay muted, mute yourselves. I would also like to say we have a couple of programs coming up. We're planning some more programs in the winter and spring. Our next virtual program will be our annual meeting.
Just my name.
Which will be, of course, online. We're going to have Susan Benjamin, who will be talking about her new book, Modern in the Middle, Chicago Houses,
Just click on the camera.
1975.
Now you're there.
Everyone, please stay muted for the program. I'd like to also tell you that we will not have a Q&A at the end of the program. We have way too many people, but Mr. Wester has kindly offered his contact information. So if you stay to the end of the program, you will have a way to get in touch with him after. And there's also going to be a Facebook group you can join so everyone can stay connected that way. If for some reason you can't stay to the end or you miss it, just let someone at the museum know and we can give you that information. So finally, I would like to give an introduction to our speaker today, Mr. Kevin Wester. Kevin Wester was born and raised in the Luxembourg settlement of Belgium, Wisconsin, among the other Luxembourg communities in Ozaukee County. He is proud to say that he is of 100% Luxembourg ancestry and as of 2012, a dual citizen of Luxembourg and the USA. After serving as a priest in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, Kevin became the director of development for the newly formed Luxembourg American Cultural Society. He oversaw fundraising for the Cultural Center in Belgium, Wisconsin, and became its first full-time executive director in 2010. Kevin has offered presentations on numerous Luxembourg topics throughout the United States and in Luxembourg. He was knighted by Grand Duke Henri of Luxembourg and awarded a medallion of merit from Luxembourg's Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich and the Archdiocese of Luxembourg in recognition of his efforts to preserve the ties between Luxembourg and the United States. Kevin currently owns and operates small businesses, Luxembourg Adventures Tour and Travel Company, and the Lux Dual Citizenship Consultation Services. And finally, in 2019, he officially began research for his next book, which will focus on Luxembourgers in Chicago. Kevin is currently looking for stories, memories, photographs, and memorabilia pertaining to Luxembourgers in Chicago. So make sure if you have anything to share with Kevin that you stick around for his information or let us know. So without further ado, Mr. Wester.
Thanks, Rachel. She calls me Mr. Wester. You can tell she's a lot younger than I am. But thank you so much. Hey, it's good to be with everybody. And the title of my presentation today is Luxembourgers in Chicago from North Avenue to Wilmette. First of all, I want to say a thank you to the Wilmette Historical Society. I really appreciate them asking me to do this presentation. About a year and a half ago, I did a presentation on Luxembourgers in Chicago for the Edgewater Historical Society. So when the folks at Wilmette called, I was just thrilled. I've done a lot of research in the past year and a half. I hope you don't feel like this is a 3-credit course because I have a lot of content, so I'm going to keep kind of moving along quickly. But I really want to thank everybody at the Wilmette Historical Society. There you see on the screen a photograph of their building, which is the former Grosse Pointe Village Hall, because if you know the history, Grosse Pointe, eventually that community was kind of taken into Wilmette and a little portion into neighboring Evanston. So there is no Grosse Pointe anymore, but that's where the Wilmette Historical Society is, in that building, many Luxembourgers, I'm sure, were in the Village Hall. They do a great job with their museum. Visit it after COVID is settled down. They have an awesome archives, just wonderful programs, and they do a lot of community outreach. But I really today want to thank their awesome staff. They were so helpful as we pulled this together. So thank you, Kathy, Rachel, and Laura. So, Moyen, it's good to see you and welcome. And as Rachel shared, right now I've got 2 small businesses, my Luxembourg Dual Citizenship Consultation Services. So I help people get their Luxembourg dual citizenship. The original process, the deadline is over, but there's still 2 processes still open to get dual citizenship. So if you have any questions or interest, I'd be happy to help you figure out if you qualify and work with you. And then my Luxembourg Adventures tour company. Here are some folks in Luxembourg presenting their applications. And then Luxembourg Adventures, I take group tours to Luxembourg each year. And like the picture of the family on the top, the Steichen family from Chicago and Oklahoma, that group hired me. There were 18 of them, and I planned a family adventure. I was with them for a week, and we found ancestral villages and homes. And the younger couple, they went with their 4 kids and said, could I plan 5 solid days, restaurants, everything. So that's what I do with that business. So if you want to check out my website, and if you ever want to go on a great tour of Luxembourg, or if you ever need help planning your own adventure, I'd be happy to help you. When I have spare time, I love to do research, writing, and publications. That's kind of my passion, the research end of it. And publishing has just kind of always been my passion since I've been in high school. I just published a book on Lake Church, Wisconsin, which is next to Belgium, Wisconsin, where I grew up, and our Catholic parish was in Lake Church. So much of my life was spent there, and I just published that book. It's available on Amazon, and it had about 600 photographs in it. I'm super proud of that. I'm working on volume 2, which is going to be about 250 biographies of Luxembourg immigrants to the Belgium Wisconsin area. But following that, my upcoming book that I'm super fired up about is Luxembourgers in Chicago. There's been all sorts of little bits and pieces written, about the brotherhood, there's parish histories, but there really isn't a book that brings it all together. And that is kind of a dream, a legacy that I want to leave behind. Though I did not grow up in Chicago, a number of my relatives from Ozaukee County, first generation, moved to Chicago. So I've got my Chicago cousins who I just love. And because of my role at the Cultural Center, over the years, I learned a lot about the history of Luxembourgers in Chicago. It is a profound history that must be written. It's very unique. Chicago is the largest, concentration of Luxembourger immigrants. So that is my goal, and what I plan on doing. I'm in the research phase now. Hopefully a year from now, I'm going to begin writing. And I'll talk more about that because I am looking for your help in doing this book. I can't do it alone. It's going to take all of us. I have to put in a plug for the Luxembourg American Cultural Society and Center. I feel like it's my kid, my child in Belgium, Wisconsin, where I grew up. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Cultural Society and the Center. I would highly encourage you to join the Cultural Society. It's like your conduit back to Luxembourg, and it's just an incredible resource. And if you haven't visited the Cultural Center in Belgium, Wisconsin, it's really an awesome experience. The old stone barn is the last Luxembourgish stone barn in Wisconsin. We moved it, had it rebuilt. It's called the Roots and Leaves Museum. And then the silver, kind of more modern addition is the Dooley Wagner Research Center. It is the largest research center for Luxembourg studies and genealogy outside of Luxembourg. And when I left my position there 5 years ago, I donated my life's collection, 40 years worth of archival material and artifacts, and it's just a phenomenal research center. So if you haven't been a part of this, I really encourage you to get on board with the Luxembourg American Cultural Society and Center. Something else I just want to share, I know that people, that are attending today, some of you are probably heavy-duty genealogists doing your Luxembourg thing like me for 40 years. Some of you maybe just discovered a few months ago or a year ago that you are Luxembourgers, so it might be new for you. So I just want to, before I get into this talk, show you this really cool partition map of Luxembourg. You see Luxembourg today, it's the dark bordered country. We're used to seeing it sort of like a triangle. Luxembourg originally was 3 times the size that it is as of 1839. So this little partition map shows you that there was a little chunk of Luxembourg that became France in 1659. Then a large chunk of Luxembourg, kind of the district of Bitburg, Germany today, the other side of the Moselle in 1815, that was ceded to Prussia. And last partition was in 1839 to your left, that's the province of Luxembourg in Belgium. So Luxembourg used to be 3 times as big. And I run into people all the time that like, we guys thought we were really Belgian, but if we go back, we were Luxembourgers, or we thought our family was German, but we realized before 1815, we were Luxembourgers. So if you're doing genealogy, it's just really important to know about those 3 historic partitions. So at one point, you might have been Prussian, but prior to that, you might have been a Luxembourger. So that's a resource I always like to share with people just to make sure they have that background. Looking at Luxembourg immigration in general, there were 5 different waves of Luxembourg immigration. This material I am presenting, it was researched by John Claude Muller and John Ench in the 1970s and 80s. John Ench, many of you people know him. Those 2 are really 2 legendary historians, researchers who studied Luxembourg immigration. So this is their material. I'm giving it to you as the backdrop to Luxembourgers in Chicago. So 5 major waves of immigration from Luxembourg. The first was in early, 1800s, 1828. Luxembourgers went to Brazil, Argentina, and Guatemala. About 1,000 Luxembourgers went to South America. Some of them ran into calamity with illnesses because of the different climates, but Brazil still has a very strong Luxembourg community. In fact, I know that many people that apply for Luxembourg dual citizenship are Brazilians who are seeking EU, participation in Luxembourg citizenship. And it's kind of fun because they're Brazilian, but some of them have super Luxembourgish names, like my friend William Weber. He's an Argentinian named William Weber. The second kind of major wave of immigration was 1830 to 1844. This was the first wave to the United States. Luxembourgers settled in New York, in Erie and Wyoming counties, and then in central Ohio. Many of these early folks were from what's called the Arlerland, Arlon, if you've been to Luxembourg, is that Belgian city just over the Luxembourg border. It's called Arles in Luxembourgish. The Arlerland is a region around the city of Arlon that language-wise years ago was Luxembourgish speaking. Right beyond it, French began. So the Arlerland is a strip around Arlon, what is today Arlon, Belgium. They were Luxembourgers, they spoke Luxembourgish, and they were early to immigrate to the United States. At that time, 1839, they became part of Belgium. So some of them came as Luxembourgers, some of them came as Belgians, but they were ethnically Luxembourgers. The third major wave was 1845 to 1860. I come from Ozaukee County, Wisconsin. That's when our people came here, 1845. I'll talk more about that. That's when Chicago started to get, a huge influx of Luxembourgers, 1845. They also went to Minnesota, around Rolling Stone, Caledonia, and then also around Dubuque and St. Donatus, Iowa. So in that area, the land that was kind of open was Wisconsin, Illinois, getting into Minnesota and Iowa. The fourth major wave came in 1860 to 75, started going to Aurora, Illinois, huge Luxembourg settlement, and northwestern Illinois, western Minnesota, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota. So this immigration waves were always a movement further west because more land was opening up. The fifth wave, kind of the final wave of Luxembourg immigration, 1875 to 1925, huge era for Chicago as far as Luxembourg immigration. It just absolutely mushroomed. They also went further west to Kansas, Nebraska, Montana. And then there was an interesting phenomenon. New Luxembourgers came, and often first generation people, like from Ozaukee County, kind of came together and formed settlements further in the west, like in Kansas. So that was an interesting phenomenon, how first generations made their own colonies with new Luxembourg immigrants further west. There's a 1906 souvenir book from the Luxembourg Brotherhood of America. And in 1906, here are the numbers they gave. The largest settlements of Luxembourgers in the US in 1906 were Chicago with 16,000, estimated 500 Luxembourg immigrants. Dubuque had 5,000, Aurora had 5,000, Ozaukee County had 4,000, and St. Paul had 2,000. There were many other communities, but that's what it recognizes as the highest concentrations in 1906. This is a great map, and it kind of shows in general the major Luxembourg settlements. Started in New York, Ohio, Wisconsin, Illinois, out to Minnesota, Iowa. Again, it's always a progression west as land was becoming available, the cheapest land. All right, I want to talk then about this huge wave of Luxembourg immigration in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. That's waves 2, 3, 4, 5. It's estimated that 76,000 Luxembourgers immigrated to America. Now, if you compare 76,000 to the number of Germans or Italians or Irish, it is really minuscule. But for little Luxembourg, imagine 1/4 of the population, 1 out of 4 Luxembourgers felt the need to leave their homeland to strike out for a better life and survival in America. Most of our ancestors that left in that time, we were mostly from the lower middle class. We weren't the poorest of the poor. They would have not been able to afford the trip, but we were the low middle class. These folks sold everything on their farm. They sold, their dishes, their farm animals, their pile of manure, everything went so they could get enough money to bring their family to America, to have some money to buy some cheap land and to start their new life. So I'd like to talk about the push-pull factors that brought people from Luxembourg to America. And again, this comes from the work of John Ench, John Claude Muller, and Robert Owen. So what were the forces pushing our ancestors out of Luxembourg? First of all, there was an increase in population because hygiene was improving. Probably most important is the second one, excessive partitioning of available farmland amongst all the children at the time of the inheritance. At the time of the French Revolution, the whole practice of inheritance changed. Instead of the little farm in Luxembourg going to the oldest son, they followed the practice of the French after the French Revolution, and it got divided equally amongst all children, male and female. So imagine your ancestor has this dinky little farm in a little town in Luxembourg. He dies, his wife died, they have 10 kids. It's cut into 10. There were no way that people could survive on this because of that practice. That's one of the biggest reasons Luxembourgers, majority were farmers, came to America, because they needed land. They couldn't survive on what they had. Also, poor harvests for farmers and vintners. One of my great-great-great-grandfathers who came to Wisconsin, he was a vintner. I know where his vineyards are in Besch-Kleinmacher. There were poor harvests for a few years. He was a successful guy, but because his grape harvests were horrible, he was struggling and had to get out. Another push factor were high taxes, avoidance of compulsory military service on behalf of foreign neighbors, uncertain political climate, and the Industrial Revolution. So those things were pushing people out of Luxembourg. What were the pull factors? What were drawing them to America? I think the biggest one is the availability of large tracts of cheap land. They had no land, not enough to survive in Luxembourg. You could come to America and for free or next to nothing, get huge portions of land. It was unthinkable. And they needed to do this to survive and to allow for a legacy for their family. They also here had the possibility of a higher income. Social advancement would be more possible here. There was also this perception of America as a paradise. You know, the streets are paved with gold. People would write back letters and they heard things. And when they got here, they realized things weren't all so perfect as what they had been told. It was pretty primitive. And also they had relatives who they heard about who were successful. They always talk about their rich uncle in America. He struck it rich. Let's go to America by our uncle. Maybe we can be rich too. Now for Luxembourgers in Illinois. So I'm narrowing it down to Chicago. Nicholas Goner, in his book, Luxembourgers in the New World, if you don't have that in your collection, go on the Luxembourg American Cultural Society's website, their gift shop, buy it. It's the most important account of Luxembourg immigration to America in the 19th century. So Luxembourgers in the New World. Goner, who wrote it out of Dubuque, Iowa, states that in Illinois, Luxembourgers settled the most in Cook County, but also in Kane, DuPage, Lake, Will, and LaSalle counties. In the Northwest, so by the Mississippi, in that corner of Illinois, they went to Joe Davies and Stevenson's counties. Those Luxembourgers were kind of across the river from Dubuque, Iowa, and were very associated with the Dubuque, Iowa Luxembourgers. And then Goner says there's small groups of Luxembourgers in Illinois and Putnam, Ford, and Alexander counties. Goner also says in his book, Goner states that the main occupation of Luxembourgers in Illinois, true for the rest of the country, was agriculture. They were farmers, but they also engaged in Illinois in occupations from day laborers to optician. I happen to have this awesome picture. Nicholas Watering Company, he was an optician. He was born here in Holy Cross, Wisconsin. First generation, no work. He went down to Chicago, became an optician. This was his store on Randolph Street. So there's an optician, just like Goner said. But Goner didn't mention that we Luxembourgers love our saloons. He should have said they had saloons as well, because loads and loads of Chicago Luxembourgers had saloons. I just for fun threw two of them in here. The building on the bottom, many of you Chicagoans know if you hang out in Andersonville and Edgewater and all that stuff, the Wild Pansy gift shop today, awesome at Gethsemane Garden Center. I've stopped there many times. Well, that when you're there shopping next, realize it was a Luxembourger saloon. The Winandy brothers had it, Scheuers and the Schmitzes. Also, I want to highlight John Schmidt's saloon on Clark Street. John, there's a picture of John and his wife, was from Echternach. An important guy. He was the first acting president of the Luxembourg Brotherhood as they were forming, and was just a mover and shaker in the Brotherhood. And how cool it is today in Metro Chicago, his grandson Art, who's on it in his 90s, and his great-granddaughter Jean Schmidt-Spagnoli, who I know is on this conference, they carry on the work that he began in the Brotherhood. So that's how his saloon looked on Clark Street in the past, and that's the building today. So Luxembourgers love their saloons. Goner further says that Luxembourg immigrants politically to Illinois were primarily Democrats, and we won't get into that in light of the election. Democrat isn't exactly the same as what it is today, neither is Republican, but in that era, they were overwhelmingly Democrats. And in religion, for the most part, they were Roman Catholic. This picture is St. Henri's on Ridge and Devon. All those kids are waiting for the Corpus Christi procession to begin. As soon as the priest came out of St. Henri's with the Eucharist and the monstrance, off they were going to begin in their procession. Now, for Luxembourg immigration to Chicago, with that as the backdrop. It is not definitively known. We don't know who the first Luxembourger was that we can say, that guy, that couple, they were the first Luxembourgers. Perhaps it was John Beck, an immigrant from Protz, Luxembourg. He emigrated in 1844. But in 1845, it marks the first group of documented Luxembourgers settling in Chicago. So there were some families that settled in Chicago together. We have this documented. They sailed on a very, very important ship. if you've never heard of it, the Sylvanus Jenkins. And this ship was really organized by two families. You see the photograph of the couple there, the last names, Weicker and Watry. They lived in the Arlerland, right by Arlon, right at the border of Belgium and Luxembourg. They sent a scout over, Nicholas Watry, 2 years previous. He went to look where in America a group of people from that region should emigrate to. He went to New York, Ohio. He ended up in Wisconsin. He went back to Luxembourg, and in 1845, a ship filled predominantly with Luxembourgers, the first biggest kind of group there, came to the United States. They settled in Ozaukee County, where I grew up, in the little community of Holy Cross. So the Sylvanus Jenkins departed Antwerp in May of 1845, arrived on Independence Day, 1845. According to the manifest, all the passengers were bound for Wisconsin. But listen to this. In reality, 3 families stayed on in Chicago. And these are the folks that we can count amongst the earliest Luxembourgers in Chicago. And here they are: Nicholas Faber and his family, William Sinner and his family, and Pierre Plachette. Nicholas Krantz, he arrived in New York 4 days later after this other group did, and he made his way to Chicago and settled with the others. So why he wasn't on the ship, but apparently there was a connection between he and the other 3 families that settled in Chicago. These 3 Luxembourg families, they settled in the Edgewater Ridge region on the north side of Chicago. This is what Goner writes about them in 1889. When they settled in 1845, they encountered a wilderness with some woods, bad meadows, pastures, and moors. They bought an acre of land for $3 or $4 and thought that they had not struck a good bargain. But look at this, 40 years later, the land was worth about $500 to $1,500 an acre because of growing Chicago. So these Luxembourgers settled on the north side, Edgewater, the Ridge, the boonies, the wilderness. It was not a city. It was glacial land that was left over, some wooded, very sandy, not the easiest to deal with for farmers. In ensuing years, the largest concentration of Luxembourg immigrants flocked to Chicago's north side. So Chicagoans, the north side, you hold the distinction, the largest settlement of Luxembourgers in the United States. And where did they settle? Heavily from the German Roman Catholic neighborhood around St. Michael's, Old Town, North Avenue, all the way up to Wilmette. Some settled on the south side, the Stockyard area, and the Mill Gates on the south side, but mostly North Avenue to Wilmette, thus the name of this talk. Many of the city Luxembourgers living around North Avenue, they suffered serious, complete losses in the Chicago fire of 1871. There's a little map of the Chicago fire going up to Fullerton. And St. Michael's Church, which I'll talk about, which was the Luxembourgers' church in the city, you see a sketch of the destruction. It was brick, but it still was destroyed. They used the walls and rebuilt the St. Michael's that you see today. So the Luxembourgers were a part of that parish and a part of the rebuilding of St. Michael's in Old Town. Okay, Chicago experienced massive immigration in all 3 waves. So all 3 waves, people came to Chicago. That isn't true of Wisconsin. They only came here in that 1845 to 1860. It was pretty much done. But Chicago, all 3 waves. Chicago was a clearinghouse for new immigrants to Western destinations. I've talked to many people where they said, my great-grandpa came to Chicago. He worked at a greenhouse or on a farm for 2 years, got money, learned English a little bit, and moved to Nebraska. So new Luxembourgers, especially in 1875 to 20, came to Chicago. They often worked on these truck farms, greenhouses, or worked for fellow Luxembourgers, learned some English, got adjusted, earned a little bit of money, off to Nebraska, off to Oklahoma, off to Minnesota. That's the way it worked. Chicago was a clearinghouse. Also, this is interesting, by the late 1870s, many first-generation Luxembourg Americans from other settlements moved to Chicago, especially where I grew up around Port Washington, Ozaukee County. They had huge families. There was not enough farmland or opportunity. These are relatives of mine. 3 of my cousins married 3 even brothers. They grew up in Port Washington, but there was nothing for them to do. So they went to the north side of Chicago by the Luxembourgers, their fellow Luxembourgers, had shoe stores, jewelers, opticians. So Chicago grew not only from new immigrants, but from first generations of other communities that did not have enough opportunity. That's living proof in my family. Over time, the largest concentration of Luxembourgers was like from Edgewater, Rose Hill, High Ridge, West Ridge, Rogers Park, Evanston, Niles Center, Grosse Pointe, Wilmette. You get a sense of that strip right along the lake. The distinctive heart of Luxembourgers lay, as they'd say in Luxembourgish, op de ridge, on the ridge. That's the area of Chicago that was equated with Luxembourgers, the ridge. What the heck is the ridge? Now, I have a mini geology, not genealogy, but a mini geology lesson. So, little geology with Chicago. Metro Chicago's typography is a product of glaciers. So a big glacier was there. Chicago was a lake bottom, and various areas are marked with landforms called spits. A spit is a formation of elevated sediment left from a glacier that forms off of lakeshore. So a spit is sediment from after the glacier. It leaves behind it a lengthy and elevated ridge of land sediment, thus the name the ridge. So it's sediment from the recession of the glacier. It's leftover stuff from the glacier. Geologists recognize 3 spits or ridges on the north side of Chicago. Wilmette Spit, basically Ridge Avenue, Rose Hill, that's around St. Henri's, Evanston to Rose Hill, Ridgeville, down to Devon, and the Graceland Spit, if you know Chicago there, Graceland Cemetery on Clark. So 150 years later, of course, we don't see this glacial ridge with all the development as much as it was there originally. Where old St. Henri's Church is located, many of you know, St. Henri's, the Cathedral of the Luxembourgers, Ridge and Devon, that was originally referred to that area as Ridgeville or High Ridge as Rose Hill. That's kind of the epicenter. So the ridge is that region extending from Wilmette down to Graceland Cemetery, and basically St. Henri's, Ridge and Devon is kind of the center. That's where the Luxembourgers were. If you thought of Luxembourgers, you thought of the ridge. What are the 3 hallmarks that I have identified of Chicago Luxembourgers? So this is kind of my talk, the 3 main hallmarks. I want to talk about their truck farms and greenhouses, their Catholic parishes and institutions, their societies and social events. Luxembourgers in Chicago did all sorts of things for occupations. John Mertz had cemetery monuments. Peter Schock was a police inspector. Very well-known, controversial guy. Frank Decker, he had his little general store and delivered his groceries. Henry Krantz had a real estate business. The O'Bladens, originally from Port Washington, had a big printing company. The Knopf brothers, a buffet, and you always need an undertaker. And the Luxembourgers had a number of Luxembourg undertakers like Weimers Kirsch, and he also had a private ambulance to get you to a hospital. But the occupation, the career that really was uniquely Luxembourgers were their truck farms or greenhouses. This is what they had their reputation for. The Luxembourgers of Chicago had identity because of their truck farms and their greenhouses. So Luxembourgers north of the city, they settled in the undeveloped ridge wilderness. They were overwhelmingly farmers. They settled the land, they transformed it into productive farmland. Listen to what Goner writes about the ridge area. If this area more resembles a big garden than a desert today, the change is attributable to Luxembourgers. With superhuman effort, they transformed the sandy plain of the ridge into vegetable gardens and the moors into fertile fields. Soon, the Luxembourg truck farm industry began. Wagons and later gas engine vehicles were used to truck the produce to downtown Chicago's market. Why? To feed the growing masses in the city. The city is booming. They need food. So there was a great opportunity for the Luxembourgers to truck their produce down to Chicago to the markets to feed the hungry masses. Donner writes, they sell their vegetables at the market on South Water Street. They drive home Chicago dung to enrich their land. So leave it to a Luxembourger. You don't come home with an empty wagon. You bring the manure along because you need it for your greenhouse, your truck farm. Luxembourg residents on the ridge demonstrated what industrious and tough-minded diligence are capable of producing in the long run. This is an awesome picture. Think about these truck farmers. This is John Hovley. His parents were from Groningen. His wife Josephine, his daughter. This is in Skokie, in Niles Center. They're crating tomatoes on their truck farm. So this is typical what life was like and what it looked like. This is awesome too. John Hovley with his truck loaded with produce to sell at the South Water Street Market. Written on his truck, John Hovley, gardener, Niles Center. And that's what they saw as their occupation, gardener. So there he is, loaded up, cabbage, lettuce, everything that he had. He'd come back with a nice chunk of change for what he sold. Here's another picture, the Hovley family on their truck. And if you know Skokie, looking at the distance at those fields, that's what Skokie, that's what these communities in the north were like. They were farmland before they became suburbia. I want to thank my friends Joyce Burns and John Jeanetton for these awesome pictures they shared from their family. So they took their stuff where? Most of them to the South Water Street Market. There it is, crazy place. Vegetables and flowers were sold. And on the side, they had commission houses. So you had to work through them. Of course, everyone wanted to get a little piece of the action. And at that era, at the turn of the century, they called it the busiest street in the world. Now, these truck farmers had to get up, these poor guys, at 2 and 3 in the morning, because it took a long time in your wagon and even your old gas, engine truck to get to the market, and you had to get a good spot. So they got up super early in the morning. Here's another ad for a market much closer to the ridge on Clark and Ridge. This is from a Schobermess book in 1921. And I love it because they used English, but then also Luxembourgish to woo the Luxembourg farmers. So in Luxembourgish, it says, the Luxembourg vegetable gardeners are specially invited to sell their garden and field products here. So I'm sure some of them thought, why go all the way to the South Water Street Market? This one's right in our backyard. Originally, Luxembourgers planted their crops in the open, as farmers do. But later, they added hotbeds and full hot houses.
Yeah, remember we had some.
To allow for early production and year-round production to keep up with growing demand. So these Luxembourgers were smart. They thought, hey, if I can make like a hotbed, as John Hovley did here, it looked like windows, I could start my plants earlier in the spring. Or they thought, if I have a hothouse or a greenhouse, man, I could farm all year long. So these again are at the Hovley farm in Niles Center. Okay, so the greenhouses really took off in about 1890. And Luxembourgers are equated as the largest ethnic group in Chicago to own greenhouses. Again, it's what brought fame and legacy to Luxembourgers in Chicago. In a greenhouse, imagine this, you could grow 6 crops of lettuce from autumn to May and 2 crops of cucumbers in autumn 1 and in spring. So much better growing inside in a winter climate. The large boxes in a greenhouse that they grew their plants in had to be fertilized with manure, which you'd bring back from the market 4 times a year, and they would replace that ground every 3 years. Now, what about the cost? 1906, a 150-foot by 150-foot greenhouse, imagine, cost $8,000 in 1906 to build it. The glass was expensive, but especially that coal heating system. To heat it with coal in a winter climate, that whole system was super expensive. There you see Charles Hengisch, a Luxembourger's greenhouse, what it looked like. And there was always that smokestack or chimney because of the heating system. Okay. Then there's a historian, her name is Marie Berthe Frieders Kunzinger, an excellent paper if you've ever seen it, Luxembourg Immigration to the USA. This is what she writes about these Luxembourgers. After the Civil War and with the Industrial Revolution, the Luxembourgers of Chicago fostered the production of vegetables on an industrial scale. That is the perfect description. They were growing vegetables like an industry. It was industrial scale. In 1900, for instance, 1,200 families were involved in the greenhouse and gardening business. And there's Charles Hengish inside of the greenhouse. His boy doesn't look thrilled for the picture, probably just had to work and work and work, all right? Let me just get to my next slide here. I apologize, it's not moving forward for some reason. The wonders of technology. I am going to stop let's see if I can get it to move. Sorry about this, folks. Let me just stop the share for a second and let me get back in here. All right, I apologize. Let's see if I can, why it's being uncooperative. Sorry about this, the wonders of technology. Let me get to where we were and I will pick it up. And I may not be able to do full screen for some reason. It's acting a little bit disobedient. Okay, here we go. So the Luxembourgers on Chicago's Ridge rightfully earned their nickname. So people call the Luxembourgers the glass house people. And I think of the old adage, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. In the early years, Luxembourgers grew vegetables. So the industry began by growing vegetables to feed Chicago. But with the rise of refrigerated boxcars hauling vegetables from California, because vegetables don't rot quickly for the most part, so they could be shipped in from California, this gave way to the Luxembourgers on the north side, transitioning many of them to growing flowers, primarily roses and carnations. And there was a growing demand in the city for for flowers, especially in winter. And if you know this region near the Ridge, huge cemeteries, Rose Hill, St. Boniface, Graceland, huge demand for funeral flowers right in the region where they live. I'd like to just kind of profile one greenhouse owner because it's kind of cool. This is George Veeder and Helen Reinberg. George was born in Beeson. Helen was born in Protz. She is an aunt of Peter Reinberg, who's considered Chicago's Carnation King. I'll talk about him in a second. But Helen and George were engaged. They went to Paris with her mother to earn money for their passage to the USA. They got married in Paris in 1856. They had a son a year later. And that following October, they set sail for America. Sadly, their little boy died, was buried at sea. After they got to Chicago, as many of these immigrants did, they came to the Ridge, they started farming or worked for a Luxembourg farmer on his truck farm. But eventually, the Veeders set up their own greenhouse. It was called the Rogers Park Floral Company. Now, this is what Donner writes about them, okay? So this is a little report of what it was like at the Veeders greenhouse. So he said, a report about a fellow Luxembourger, George Veeder, a florist, he had 75,000 square feet circumference. So 75,000 square feet under glass, imagine. Mr. Veeder has given us a show of his hothouse walking with us. Imagine the flowers, a show of flower beds, 19,000 roses, industrial, 10,000 carnations, 3,000 violets. A gardener with 6 workmen loaded freight with flowers. Every morning with the flowers blooming, the men work well into the night to prepare and ready their orders. With great care and dignity, they process the flowers into bouquets for their shipment into the city of Chicago to shops for resale or their own retail shop. Mr. Veeder told us that during the winter in Chicago, this is 1894, he could receive 80 to 90 cents or even up to as much as $1 for American Beauty rose. Imagine that in 1894, $1 a rose. Plainly speaking, the secret weapon to his great growing success in the hothouse were the tubes that whirled the water through pipes. So that steam system and the watering system that was in there. In winter, when the outside is freezing, inside there's lettuce, cucumbers, beans, and generally all vegetable greens, which in a hothouse would naturally grow well. So this is how he summarizes it, Goner. In a city like Chicago, it is not unlikely to have an enormous volume of business, causing an increase in prices for their products. So it's not surprising that all the Luxembourgers profit from their horticultural management. So they were super successful. I could not talk about greenhouses without talking about Peter Reinberg, Chicago's millionaire Luxembourger Carnation King. He was born on the Ridge, went to St. Henri's. His parents were Luxembourg immigrants from Protz. Many of the Protz people from that village settled on the Ridge. They got there early, 1845. He was the largest and best known greenhouse owner in the Midwest. Everyone in America in the greenhouse business knew Peter Reinberg. His story is rags to riches, little education, worked on his parents' vegetable farm, but he was a very intelligent and capable boy. At age 14, strong guy, he'd take 160-pound bags of potatoes, load up his wagon with these 160-pound bags, and they would trust their 14-year-old boy with everything to go to that crazy South Water Street market, and the boy would come home with $30 for a huge wagon of potatoes. Pretty good. But in 1890, Peter turned the family's 16-acre farm from turnips and tomatoes and experimented with 4 small greenhouses, and he started growing roses and carnations. He grew the business, he got 4 more acres, and he put 20 acres under glass, 1,200,000 square feet of glass. Over time, he invested $500,000 in glass and the steam heating system. And instead of bringing home a wagon empty from potatoes of $30, he would take 2 wagons a day of roses and carnations, and he would bring home $1,500 a wagon in 1910. There was money for this. Imagine Christmas time in a winter climate to get these flowers. In 1904, a directory of florists said Chicago had 32 wholesale dealers, 814 retailers, and 15% of the wholesalers did 80% of the business, that they had a total of 200 acres under glass. Peter Reinberg had 20. So he had 1/10 of the greenhouses that all the wholesalers had. Huge business. In 1904, Reinberg had a carnation campaign. He was running for Chicago alderman. He thought, what better way to get my name out there? I will give some of my carnations, which was an expensive little commodity, to my constituents. He handed out in that year over 250,000 carnations in his campaign with a ribbon that said, vote for Peter Reinberg. Needless to say, he won. He eventually was president of the Cook County Board of Commissioners, very well known, controversial at times. He was president of Chicago's Board of Education. He was the first president of the Cook County Forest Preserve. So you folks that know the Cook County Forest Preserve, he acquired the first 18,000 acres of forest preserve land. He's considered the father of the Cook County Forest Preserve. So next time you're in the forest preserves, think about that Luxembourger, the millionaire carnation king, Peter Reinberg. He also was a founder of St. Gregory's Church, which is on Bryn Mawr and Paulina. And there you will see St. Gregory's as it looks today. But one of my favorite things about him is in 1914, scandalously, he built a $60 million mansion on Sheridan Avenue. And the biggest scandal was that his bathtub was fitted with 14-karat gold. And I put that little cartoon picture from the Chicago Tribune. That's Peter Reinberg basking in his gold bathtub. It was scandal in Chicago. Peter died in 1921 at 63 of an embolism, and he's buried with his family in St. Henri's. And considering he was filthy rich, this is the Reinberg, his parents' gravestone. And Peter has this little marker on the ground. It's very simple, very humble and modest. That's Peter Reinberg. Now, the truck farm and greenhouse industries also spurred on related industries, okay? And one of the related industries were greenhouse builders, okay? And the best known was Michael Winandy, a Luxembourg immigrant. He was born in Meerscheid, Luxembourg in 1847. He was a cabinet maker, so he was a woodworker, construction guy, came to Chicago with his brother in 1869, studied English. He was smart. I need to work at my English. And they rented a farmland together in Lakeview, just south of the ridge. But a year later, 1871, the Chicago fire hit, and Michael saw that there was money to be made in helping to rebuild after the fire. So he did that for 2 years. But that's a picture of Michael Winandy's crew finishing up a greenhouse, and that's an ad for he and his sons when their boys were in this business. He went back into gardening a few years later and discovered, and he was on the ridge, he moved there, and he started his own building company with greenhouses, Michael Winandy Greenhouse Construction Company. He also built greenhouses for himself, and he operated a thriving greenhouse business. And again, he started with vegetables, went into flowers, mostly roses and carnations. There he is with 2 of his 3 sons that were in World War I. A publication called The American Florist. This is what he writes about Michael Winandy, because he was big, the biggest name in building greenhouses. He writes, Michael Winandy is one of the men who set the style on High Ridge, out Rogers Parkway. He is the contractor who built the Chicago Carnation Company's greenhouse range, and he built a great many of the greenhouses north of town. Probably more than any one person has built in all that great glass-covered section. For greenhouses are thicker there on the ridge than anywhere else west of New Jersey, and the extent in square feet is vastly larger than in any other neighborhood in America. So the ridge, the north side, they had more greenhouses, more land under glass than any other neighborhood in the US. Those are the Luxembourgers. Michael was very progressive, and he was on the cutting edge of construction. In 1902, he built his own greenhouses. There you can see photographs of the outside and the inside. He was the first to follow the patent design of Anton Dietsch, who was a well-known greenhouse designer. It was state-of-the-art. It was taller, more glass on the side walls, better ventilation, and most importantly, it retained more heat because that's what cost the most. Michael's sons were involved with the business over the years, so the Winandys were known as a name within the greenhouse construction business. Various branches of the family continued in the greenhouse construction. Even today, there are Winandy Greenhouse Company. Descendants of Michael continue in Richmond, Indiana. And the Winandy Greenhouse Company in Indiana is one of the largest greenhouse contractors in the Midwest. They have their own registered trademark greenhouse that's called Sunmade. So it continues well over 100 years later. Other related greenhouse businesses that Luxembourgs were a part of included building boilers, maintaining them, producing boxes for vegetables and seeds. Here are 2 ads. Nicholas Creer, one of the best boiler works guys. He built the boilers for greenhouses. He installed them. He maintained them, a fellow Luxembourger. Stephen Loesch, a Luxembourger. He, with his crew there, they made lettuce and tomato boxes because you needed boxes to haul your produce to the markets. Greenhouse families were of the same culture. They were farmers under glass. Thus, they often intermarried because they knew one another. They went to the same parishes. So this is a great family picture of John Peter and Catherine Shaw Leiter. So a Leiter married a Shaw, 2 greenhouse families, of course. And then their daughter, Helene, in the back row, married Fred Pesce, another super well-respected greenhouse family. So they always kept it in the family. They were of the same culture. Now, running a greenhouse took the whole family. This is a farm, no animals, but it's a farm under glass. So even little kids, everyone was involved. There you see some of the Kinch family, Winandys, Fred Pesce, when his kids were younger, and even as they were older, they all worked at the greenhouse, all hands on deck. It's difficult to imagine how that region of the ridge looked before it got developed. Everywhere you looked were farms and greenhouses and those tall chimney smokestacks That's what dominated the landscape. And on the right is an image of a 1906 Sanborn fire map. It's a 4-block radius near St. Henri's. And imagine, the Achettes, the Cleasons, the Mershes, the Schulls, and the Mertens, all Luxembourg families, had greenhouses next to one another as neighbors in that 4-block radius. That's what this area was like. There was the slow demise, though, of the greenhouse and the truck farms. It began slowly after World War I. Why? Because Chicago, the city, kept growing and pushing north, and they needed new land to be developed into residential neighborhoods. In that paper, Luxembourg Immigration to the United States, Frieders Kunzinger writes, urban development, land speculation, competition from elsewhere in the USA, and the lure of less arduous urban occupations undermined the greenhouse industry after the 1920s, and with it, the most important base of Luxembourg identity in Chicago. So she's saying greenhouses were their hallmark of their identity. It started to dissipate because of all the development. Luxembourg greenhouse owners profited well from the sale of their land and businesses. Again, they bought that land pretty cheap. They sold it to these developers for neighborhoods and really made some good money, many of them. All right. Then, it's not over with yet. There are numerous families that carry on the Luxembourg greenhouse tradition. While the majority of the Luxembourg greenhouses closed up shop and went out of business, sold their land over the years, there still are some prominent Luxembourg greenhouse families keeping the tradition alive. I'm going to highlight a couple. West End Florist and Garden Center. It's been in the Hoffman family, Luxembourgers, since 1908. Matthias came over here from Guesdorf, Luxembourg in 1894, and typical, he went to the Ridge, Rogers Park area, worked as a laborer, and then he married Catherine Luch, was of Wilmette in 1901. But in 1908, he decided to go his own route. He worked on someone else's farm long enough. He purchased 20-acre truck farm in Grosse Pointe, which now it's in Evanston. It extended north to Old Orchard Road, to Old Glenview Road, to Crawford Road. And at first they grew simple things like radishes and potatoes to sell to locals. But in 1920, they realized there was more money and it was better to be in flowers. Why? Because a local florist was necessary. You could not ship flowers such long distances. In 1927, he became an FTD florist. His son Edwin took over in the 1930s, so it's passed on. He shifted, though, to bedding plants and ornamentals. In the 60s and 70s, the next generation, third generation, George and Richard came in, brothers. It was the 70s, so they added interior and tropical plants because that was a trend. The 80s, they boomed in bedding plants and colorful ornamentals like magnolias, dogwood. George brought out his brother in the 90s. And then in 1997, George's daughter, Elizabeth, became a co-owner. And there's a picture of Elizabeth. When you grow up at a greenhouse, even you have a baby buggy picture at the greenhouse because that's your life. Elizabeth worked there since she was 12. She might even be on the call today. And she studied business at Indiana University. Elizabeth and her husband, Ernie, are the current owners. So this business is 112 years in a fourth generation Luxembourg family. These are pictures I took a few weeks ago at Halloween. I got to meet Elizabeth. She's a woman greenhouse keeper, a Luxembourger, carrying on her great-grandpa's tradition. Then I'd like to highlight Cleason's as well. Cleason Wholesale, which is on Florist Avenue in Evanston, and they have other locations too in Northbrook, Lake Villa, and Grayslake. The Cleason greenhouses were begun by John Cleason, who was born in Heisdorf. He came here as a 25-year-old man in 1889. Again, he worked for someone else on the Ridge on their farm. He married a Luxembourg girl at St. Henri's. He eventually purchased his own greenhouse on Morris, and it went up to about Western. He grew vegetables, went down to the South Water Street. This is what these guys did. His youngest son, Frank, worked for his older brother, Jack, who had at least a greenhouse. He worked for him for 2 years, but then Frank decided to set out on his own. First of all, like they did sometimes as they're starting, they rented someone else's greenhouse for a while. He raised cut flowers in winter, and then he had potted flowers in spring and summer. Then in 1946, he purchased his own 3 acres with greenhouses on Florence Avenue in Evanston from the Gersh family, another family that were greenhouse people. And he worked with cut flowers and potted plants. His son told me that the first year was tough. That first Easter, horrible weather in Chicago, they couldn't deliver much of their Easter flowers. A third of his flowers from Easter had to be dumped. It was a huge financial loss for him. In 1959, his son Dick began working in the business. They had 7 full-time employees, a family affair. All the Cleason kids were involved as kids. Dick's mother, Rosalind Welter, from a Luxembourg greenhouse family, was the bookkeeper, raised her kids, worked at the greenhouse in season. These are hardworking people. Dick's brother Fran joined the operation. It was Frank Cleason and Sons. And those 2 young guys used the latest technology, like lighting, to grow plants more quickly or taller. So technology was constantly coming in, and they had to keep up with it. In the mid-60s, they expanded. They bought additional greenhouses in South Elgin. Fran went to South Elgin, and Dick stayed running the Evanston thing. And here today, we have the next generation. In 2001, the business is divided. Dick's son, Tom and Tim on the picture with Tom's son Troy, they took over Evanston and named it Cleason Wholesale. Their sister Dawn also works there. She's part of the team in sales. Fran's son, Eric and Mike in South Elgin, they call their business Cleason Brothers. So these guys are first cousins with their greenhouse. This is a look inside Cleason's Wholesale, what it looks like in a modern day Luxembourg American greenhouse. I took these pictures in late winter. Now I have to introduce you to Super Troy, who I know is on this call. So I call him Super Troy, Troy Cleason. He is 5th generation Luxembourger in the Chicago greenhouse tradition. He's certainly one of the youngest, and he's an awesome young guy who's carrying on this beautiful, incredible historic tradition. And so when I met Troy that day, I was like, how super cool. On your jacket, you have your Luxembourg flag. And he was very proud of that. And he said, well, you know what else? I've also got a tattoo of Luxembourg. So he told me about it. So Super Troy was kind enough to send us a photograph of his tattoo, which is his Luxembourg and Chicago pride, the map of Luxembourg with the stars of the Chicago flag. So that's Super Troy. You've got to meet him. I want to highlight Pesci's Luxembourg Gardens, even though it's over the Cheddar Curtain in Franklin, Wisconsin. Ron and Sue Pesci. Ron is the grandson of Chicago greenhouse owner, very well known, Fred Pesci. And of course, his grandma, Ron's grandma, was a lighter. Ron and Sue had their business, Luxembourg Gardens, up here in Wisconsin, suburban Milwaukee, many, many years. They actually just retired and sold the property and stuff. A school is going to expand there, so it's the end of Luxembourg Gardens in Franklin. But Ron and Sue are very dear friends, major financial donors to the Luxembourg American Cultural Center. And those guys donated all of the plants, all of the annuals and perennials that are at the Luxembourg Cultural Center were from Luxembourg Gardens. So besides their monetary donation, they made another monetary donation. All the plants that are there comes from Ron and Sue Pesci. So in recognition of all that Ron and Sue and the families did, we named the gardens the Pesci Lighter Luxembourg Gardens. So that's a beautiful view of the gardens of the Luxembourg American Cultural Center in Belgium, Wisconsin. And this is the historic plaque that we placed there, telling the story of the Pescis and the Lighters and a bit about the greenhouse tradition of Chicago. There's others that carry on the Luxembourg greenhouse tradition. Now, Kinches in Palatine, awesome people. Sadly, too, this past summer, they just closed, but the younger Kinches are still in the floral-related businesses. Pesci's in Des Plaines, huge by O'Hare. Chris Pesci, brother of Ron. My friends, the Lighters in Buffalo Grove, absolutely enormous. If you go into like Sam's Club or you go into Costco, you're going to see flowers from Lighters. And even at Misericordia, which is the former Angel Guardian Orphanage, on the ridge next to Old St. Henri's, it's a place for people with special needs. They still have a greenhouse, and the folks that participate there work in a greenhouse. And their little restaurant, which is also run by people with special needs, is called the Greenhouse Inn. So there's all these wonderful remnants of the greenhouses from the Ridge, the Luxembourg greenhouses. Another hallmark of Luxembourgers in Chicago were the Catholic parishes and institutions. So now Catholicism and these Luxembourgers. The earliest families, as I said, these 5 families, 1845, 4 or 5 families, they ended up in Edgewater on the Ridge. Many more came the following years. They were first served through St. Joseph's Parish in Wilmette. St. Joe's in Wilmette was a mission in 1843. It became a parish in 1845. The immigrants were Germans, Prussians, from around the Trier district. It was the only church, the only parish between Old St. Mary's downtown and Immaculate Conception way the heck up in Waukegan. By the late 1840s, the Luxembourgers were having Mass on the Ridge in Peter Schmidt's home, and the priest from Wilmette would come to the Ridge to have Mass for those people, the early Luxembourgers there. The photo that you see is in front of St. Joe's Church in Wilmette. It's a beautiful, cool sign if you go past that corner. And it's a sign, it's metal, and it shows the old log cabin church of St. Joe's. After the bishop, at that time, Bishop Van de Velde, when he dedicated St. Joseph's first frame church in 1850, as he was driving back to Chicago, he was in the area of Ridgeville around St. Henri's and said, we must start another parish here. So St. Henri's, one of the mother parishes of Luxembourgers, was founded there in 1851 off of St. Joe's in Wilmette. These folks are what I would consider historically the 2 mother parishes of Luxembourgers. St. Henri's would be the mother parish of the rural country Luxembourgers. St. Michael's in Old Town, the mother church of the city Luxembourgers. First of all, for St. Henri's, it's really premier. I call it the Cathedral of the Luxembourgers. It was founded in 1851, predominantly Luxembourg farmers, and the others that lived there were from just over the border in Germany, were of the same culture, similar language, but this was a country parish. If you go to Ridge and Devon now, it's suburbia, you know, it's traffic, homes, apartments. It was the boonies. It was out in the country, rural land. The first priest came from St. Joe's in Wilmette. They dedicated the first church in 1852. The top picture is the first St. Henri's Church, 1852. Then the Redemptorists, who were at St. Michael's, those priests served there for a while, but eventually in 1866, they got their first resident diocesan priest. In 1871, they started a cemetery, and in 1873, they built the larger frame church. That's a church on the bottom there, kind of the etching. That was the second church, the first large frame church. Then, in 1904, they made a decision, we've got to build a new church. Cornerstone was laid in 1905. In 1906, Archbishop Quigley dedicated it, St. Henri's, which is really the cathedral of the Luxembourgers. If you have never seen the interior of St. Henri's, here are some photographs. This is probably from the 1940s. It's just magnificent. Beautiful pipe organ, the stained glass, murals, the altar work. It's just a magnificent church. So these Luxembourg farmers, greenhouse people, business people really, really laid it out to build something spectacular. They had a great architect. This is the St. Henri's today. It's known as Blessed Aloysius Stepanak Croatian Catholic Church. That's what it looks like. I took that picture the weekend before COVID hit. But the question is, who the heck let those Croatians into the Luxembourgers church? You're going to have to hang on and we'll find out. These are some more pictures of St. Henri's today. If you get a chance to go when there's Mass there and tour it, it's really beautiful. These are pictures I just took last week of St. Henri's on the corner of Ridge and Devon. Now it's a, of course, urban neighborhood church. It's seen many different ethnic groups over the years with changing demographics, but countless Luxembourger baptisms, first communions, confirmations, marriages, first masses, burials happened at St. Henri's. These are historic pictures. They opened a school in 1882. Many Luxembourg young people went to school there, staffed by the poor handmaidens of Jesus Christ, who ran the orphanage next door. St. Henri's, truly the spiritual epicenter on the Ridge. It was their spiritual home. This is a picture about 1900, St. Henri's Church. That's the second one, not the one that's sitting there in the distance. That's the first frame church, the second building. If you look on the lower left, you see kids in their white gowns, some nuns, they're in procession. Corpus Christi procession down Devon Avenue. It was the spiritual epicenter for the Luxembourgers. Also, it was a social center. So many things went on socially at St. Henri's. This is the Luxembourger music variety of Chicago. They were housed at St. Henri's. They practiced at St. Henri's. They performed at St. Henri's. So for Luxembourgers, St. Henri's was a huge social center for them culturally. St. Henri's Cemetery. This is a great fact many Chicagoans don't know. St. Henri's, Ridge and Devon, that cemetery is the only churchyard cemetery in all of Chicago. And by that I mean the cemetery is attached on the same lot as the church. It's the only one in all of Chicago. If you have never visited, do. It's packed with Luxembourgers. Even the Cracker Jack boy, who you see on the lower left corner, is buried there. But that's a story for another time. Cracker Jack boy. St. Michael's was the other mother church of the city Luxembourgers in Old Town. Founded a year later, 1852. Why? Because on North Avenue, it was just beginning to boom with Germanic people started building homes, starting businesses, and Luxembourgers were considered Germanic because of our language commonality. So in that year, Michael Diversey, who you've heard the name Diversey, he donated the land, thus it was called St. Michael's. This was the first church that they built. They rented a place for a school. In 1860, the Redemptorist Fathers out of Baltimore, a German religious group, took it over. They still have St. Michael's today. There's a monastery there. And in 1866, so 14 years later, they built a huge new brick church on the corner of Eugenia and Cleveland, St. Michael's second church. Imagine at that time, $130,000 for your church in 1866 era. But tragedy soon struck. In 1871, St. Michael's, a brick church, was not completely destroyed, but heavily destroyed, and it was rebuilt immediately. People don't know this. If you know St. Michael's, the priest who really designed this restored church, the rebuilt church out of the fire, was a Redemptorist priest, Luxembourger, born in Echternach. There were numerous Luxembourgers in that Redemptorist order. In 1871, in response to the losses of the Chicago fire, a group of Luxembourgers at St. Michael's started the first known Luxembourg society, the Luxembourg Mutual Aid Society. They paid out sick and death benefits. 2 years later, they consecrated the rebuilt church. This is magnificent St. Michael's. It's a landmark church like St. Henri's in Chicago. So it's home of the Luxembourgers that were the city Luxembourgers around North Avenue. And again, it's Germanic, so they pulled out all the stops, the best materials, the most beautiful stuff. This is what St. Michael's looks like today in Old Town, a concert going on there. Numerous Luxembourgers attended St. Michael's Church and their school. But what happened? The city kept moving north, and so did the Luxembourgers that were new and first generation from this St. Michael's area. So offspring Luxembourg parishes grew from St. Michael's and St. Henri's. One of them that grew from St. Michael's for Luxembourgers was in 1882, St. Alphonsus. It came off of St. Michael's to serve Germans, Luxembourgers in Lakeview. The Redemptorists were there as well. St. Alphonsus is the patron saint of the Redemptorists. That's why it was named that. And they built a church and school on Lincoln and Southport. And it grew even more quickly. In 1896, they built the second church, which is the magnificent St. Alphonsus that is there today. I took these photographs last week. Absolutely spectacular. So numerous Luxembourg families attended St. Alphonsus Church and School. What about around St. Henri's? Well, in 1887, St. Nicholas Church in Evanston was formed off of St. Henri's to serve the Luxembourgers and Germans living north in South Evanston and Evanston. It was organized before the church got involved, the bishops. It was just organized by local farmers and businessmen. They said, we need a Germanic church here for ourselves. Probably the leader of the pack was Nicholas Didier, an immigrant from Luxembourg. He gave land, they raffled off his land, and they started out with his donation of $1,000. They collected money, they petitioned the archbishop, and they agreed that there could be another German parish. And they named him after St. Nicholas, which is one of the most popular saints in that era in Luxembourg. They had early masses at Ducat's Hall in Evanston. They got land on Ridge Avenue, of course, and Washington Street. And then they had groundbreaking for a combination church and school in 1887. And that top photo on the left is the combination first church and school that they built. And that lasted for about 10 years, but they had a terrible fire that destroyed it. And the Sisters of St. Agnes from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, were teaching there. And the story is that one of the sisters smelled smoke. There were 160 kids in school, freezing cold, February 3rd of 1898. She smelled smoke. She went into a small kitchen room, saw the flames descending to the top portion, which was the church. She made believe nothing was happening, told the sisters and the children, because it's so cold, put on your boots, go home as fast as you can, I'm canceling school. So the kids put on their stuff, got out of there. They were thrilled to get the heck out of there because it's a free day, when actually there was a fire going to burn their building, which it did. So that nun and the other sisters were very cool, calm, and collected and saved all those kids. The new school building was built. That's the lower picture, which I took last week. Again, it was a school church. It was a temporary church until 1906 when they built their new church. So today, that second church is a social hall, chapel, gymnasium. Here's another school picture of Sister St. Agnes. I loved it because the kids on the school picture have bicycles. Some have drums. It's a super cool school picture. So in 1904, construction began. There you can see of St. Nicholas in Evanston. 1906, the first Mass. That's an old picture of the interior, old picture of the exterior. St. Nicholas today, iconic, the little St. Nicholas sign on Ridge Avenue. In 1904, St. Gregory the Great Church, as a Luxembourg parish, was formed off of St. Henri's, but to the south in Andersonville, Edgewater area. The founders were 4 men, all Luxembourgers: Peter Reinberg, the Carnation King, Kranz, Mann, Miller. Where do they meet? At a saloon. That's where you have your best meetings. So St. Gregory's Parish was brought to birth at Matt Everett Luxembourger's saloon. The millionaire greenhouse, Carnation King, Peter Reinberg, right away, $5,000 to get things rolling. Nicholas Mann donated 10 lots. They built 2, a combination church and school. You can see the pictures. But then in the 1920s, a discussion began. We need a better church. Cardinal at the time said to them, okay, but it has to be spectacular. And he knew that Peter was a member of the parish. So the Carnation King comes to the rescue. In 1924 to 26, St. Gregory's there was built for, imagine, $400,000. There was 500 families in the parish, that's it. And the largest percentage were Luxembourgers. If you have never seen St. Gregory's in Chicago, it is built with the best of the best of the best. It's like something in England, a cathedral. The best stone, the best marble, the best wood, the best stained glass, everything. These are pictures I took last summer. Again, all wooden ceiling painted. It is a cathedral like you'd see in Europe. Beautiful murals of the archangels, everything, the side altars, hand-carved pulpit, stained glass. This is how St. Gregory's looks. It's unbelievable. Then the next Luxembourg parish to be founded was in 1921. St. Margaret Mary broke off of St. Henri's to serve Luxembourgers and Germans in the West Ridge section of Rogers Park. A Luxembourger, Henri Sprunk, left $5,000. So that was the money of a Luxembourger, started that parish. They bought land on Chase and Claremont, built a temporary church, a school was organized. The lower picture is the 1924 combination church and school. That's what they did until they had more money, more established. 1937, they built the current church, which Cardinal Mundelein consecrated in 1938. That's the top picture, the current church. Now, St. Margaret Mary, probably, in my opinion, the most famous or infamous parishioner was our friend George Myers, who's on the top picture. George, his grandfather and father were founders of St. Margaret Mary. He's a lifelong member. And if you knew George, he was the Grand Poobah, Luxembourg Brotherhood of America. George was Mr. Luxembourg Brotherhood, Mr. St. Margaret Mary's. When he passed away, we're all sad to see him go 4 years ago, George left a very nice inheritance to St. Margaret Mary, the parish that his family loved, the Luxembourg church he was so proud of. Well, the priest there currently is a Filipino priest who knew George well, and he wanted to do something special to memorialize George's gift and his life there. So he contacted the Luxembourg Brotherhood and said, hey, let's get a statue of Our Lady of Luxembourg for St. Margaret Mary Church in memory of George, and we'll have a little shrine for it. Well, the Brotherhood tried to get a statue and it wasn't successful. And one of the leaders of the pack, George Jones, he's maybe listening today, George contacted me. I happened to be in Luxembourg by email, and he said, hey, we want to get a statue of Our Lady of Luxembourg, like 3 feet for George, for Margaret Mary. Could I help? Well, I was in Luxembourg, and the next day I was meeting with Cardinal Hollerich, who happens to be a cousin of mine, to talk about a family reunion. So I said to the Brotherhood, yeah, I'll talk to the Cardinal. So I had lunch the next day with the Cardinal, and I said, hey, let me tell you a story. St. Margaret Mary, Luxembourgers in Chicago, George Myers, the Grand Poobah of the Brotherhood. Would there be any chance you might have a statue of Our Lady of Luxembourg? And the Cardinal said, of course. We've closed a lot of parishes. Of course. I'd be happy to donate this in my name and on behalf of the Archdiocese of Luxembourg in memory of George Myers to St. Margaret Mary. So the statue they offered comes from St. Barbara's Church. There's a picture of it. It's right on the French border. And on Sunday, March 8th, the weekend before COVID shut down the world, the Luxembourgers in Chicago continue to make history. So the Archdiocese shipped over the statue of Our Lady of Luxembourg in their garments. There you see Father Tirso and the deacon opening up the crates. It was after Mass. It's a very diverse group. I told the story of Our Lady of Luxembourg. We talked about George. It was absolutely cool. There were some Luxembourg Brotherhood members there. George Jones, who was the leader of the pack, with the statue over here. Dick Wittry, myself, with Father Tirso and the deacon. There she is, the dressed statue of Our Lady of Luxembourg, now enshrined in St. Margaret Mary Church. Hopefully after COVID, we're going to have a big celebration in honor of George, that statue can be blessed as it should be. Another Luxembourg parish, St. Joe's in Wilmette, Grosse Pointe. Again, 1842, the first Germans came there. 1845, they got their own pastor. In the early days, the priests from St. Joe's served people on the ridge before St. Henri's. They built a frame church in 1850, a new church in 1869. They opened their parish school also. Many Luxembourgers went there. 1881, the lower picture, they renovated that previous church. And in 1936, they raised the old church because the congregation grew so much. They wanted something much more state-of-the-art, spectacular. So they consecrated the current St. Joe's Church. If you drive into Wilmette, it's a landmark in 1939. There it is. Numerous Luxembourg families attended St. Joe's in Wilmette. You go into the cemetery, you got Hermeses, Webers, Kirchens, Kalmuses, Pettingers. You see the Luxembourg heritage at St. Joseph's Cemetery in Wilmette. In 1868, St. Peter's Church in Niles Center, which today, since 1940, Skokie, was formed off of St. Joe's to serve the Luxembourg and German families. And in Niles Center, like the Hovleys, truck farmers, greenhouses, it was rural territory. In 1869, they built their first frame church and began a school a couple years later. But again, they were growing, needed something substantial. 1894, a new church was built for the growing congregation. If you've ever seen St. Peter's, it's beautiful. St. Peter's in Skokie. It was a country church in the day. Now it's in the middle of suburbia, big Skokie. And St. Peter's has numerous windows which show the donors' names, and there's so many Luxembourger windows in St. Peter's. It shows, again, the carrying on of the tradition and the proof of the heritage. St. Peter's Cemetery, filled with Luxembourgers. We've got Gleisners, Niessens, Leiters, Trausches, Grotzes. What other Catholic institutions in Chicago were Luxembourgers a part of? Well, in 1863, 5 of Chicago's North Side German parishes, St. Michael's, filled with Luxembourgers, St. Joe's, St. Francis, St. Boniface, St. Peter's, they formed what was called the German Roman Catholic St. Boniface Cemetery Association. They wanted to be a Germanic voice in the Archdiocese of Chicago because it was so strongly Irish in its hierarchy and clergy. So they formed this to speak up for the needs of the Germans. First of all, they wanted their own own cemetery on the north side for German Catholics, because again, you'd be divided ethnically. The Irish did their thing. You know, the Polish did their thing. So they wanted their own Germanic cemetery. And Luxembourgers, as I say, we were classified as German Catholics. Nothing wrong with that. It was the culture and language connections. So in 1863, a huge tract of land was purchased, today's Clark Street and Lawrence Avenue, and St. Boniface Cemetery was formed as a German Catholic for Germans, Luxembourgs, Germanic people. If you've never been there, stop. It is loaded with Luxembourg immigrants and their descendants. This is a historic picture, beautiful, and going back to this one, that was the original gate at St. Boniface. Sadly, it's gone, but that's what it looked like. Beautiful tombstones. It's worth seeing on so many levels. This is what St. Boniface Cemetery looks like today on Clark Street. Lots of Luxembourgers buried there, simple, common people, and some well-known ones. Dominic Welter, super decorated Civil War veteran, super decorated important Chicago police officer. He is buried there, and numerous others of notoriety. Now, the German Catholic St. Boniface Association, they also had a desire for their own German Catholic orphanage because there was a growing number of Germanic descent orphans. They didn't want them going to a general one. They wanted it to one that would speak German, their language, and have that culture. So in 1865, just a couple years later, the Cemetery Association St. Boniface founded Angel Guardian Orphanage. And they wanted their Germanic orphanage out of the city for the health and well-being of the orphans. So funds were collected or used from the cemetery fund, but also German parishes throughout Illinois were asked to donate. St. Michael's in Old Town was the largest contributor. So 1865, 10 acres of farmland with a house and barn were purchased. Where? On the ridge, next to St. Henri's Church. Angel Guardian Orphanage opened up next door to St. Henri's. In the next year, 1866, Angel Guardian opened with 16 orphans. The association thought they would manage it. They hired Luxembourg immigrants, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Truffler, as the first caretakers of the orphans and the property. So these poor people had 16 kids on a little farm. It was way too much. So 2 years later, 3 poor handmaids of Jesus Christ, a German women's religious order, took over the management. They purchased an additional 38 acres for more farmland to feed these kids. And the Trufflers, that nice couple that started it, were there no more with the kids, but managed the farm. This is a great photograph, 1918, the 50th anniversary of Angel Guardian. They started out with 3 nuns. By 1918, 45 nuns ministered at Angel Guardian. That's how huge this thing became. They built a larger orphanage building and convent, and it had to serve the rapid growing number of Germanic orphans. There were numerous orphans there. I've met families that were Luxembourg orphans. Angel Guardian also employed numerous local Luxembourgers to do maintenance, manage the farm, and assist with their trade program because they wanted to teach orphans a trade for their future. This is a great old picture, 1893. In the rear part, you can't see much of it, is the old horse barn. They had a shoe shop, carpenter shop, print shop. Luxembourgers, locals, worked there with these orphans teaching trades. In 1879, fire destroyed the first place. Thank goodness no one was injured or killed. The next year, they built this orphanage, which maybe you've seen photographs of, the new orphanage in 1880. A few years later, they bought 60 more acres west of the property. This made it possible that they could feed the orphanage children primarily from their own produce and dairy herd. And again, Luxembourgers helped the orphanage with the farm and the dairy herd. All right. Also, then we see that they had trade-oriented things, as I said, a shoe shop, printing. For the women, the girls, domestic kitchen things. These were postcards that they sent out of the orphans, probably for fundraising purposes, showing them learning trades. Probably the most important trade, of course, was the greenhouse and the floral department. You're in the middle of the ridge. So numerous local Luxembourgers managed the greenhouses and the floral shop, and they mentored the orphans in these trades. Here's a picture of some of the orphans at Angel Guardian working in the greenhouses. A later picture, the orphans were learning this trade. Here's a picture of the floral shop looking into the greenhouse at Angel Guardian. This is the way this looked. This was what it was like to be a part of this. The orphans working at Angel Guardian florist shop, they made countless funeral arrangements because, again, all of these cemeteries in that neighborhood, it's hard to imagine, but these are orphans learning the floral trade. There you see the delivery trucks at Angel Guardian with the orphanage buildings in the background. They delivered all over the city. In the 1910s, though, there was a debate whether you should institutionalize orphans or have home placement. And Angel Guardian kept up with the times. They set up a cottage system. So instead of huge institutional living, they brought them into smaller groups and more of a home environment. That was the trend. In 1919, there were almost 1,000 orphans in residence. This place was huge. In the 20s, they just had to expand. They didn't have enough space. And the biggest issue was their chapel was too small. This was the chapel, the old chapel there, and they needed to replace it. How are you going to fit 1,000 and nuns and the rest of the staff in there? But trouble was brewing at this moment for the Luxembourgers next door at St. Henri's because of this guy. Da-da-da-dum. It's His Eminence George Cardinal Mundelein. While the orphanage was prepared, they were ready to raise their own money, build a new chapel on site. Cardinal Mundelein insisted that they take over St. Henri's church next door, which the Luxembourgers had just built 20 years before. And he said they would need to offer the parish $300,000 so they could build a new church, school, and rectory on the west end of the property. Well, everyone was opposed to it. Despite the opposition of his consultors, the priest at Angel Guardian, the pastor, and despite the opposition of all the Luxembourgers and people at St. Henri's, go figure, when you're the Cardinal of Chicago, you get your way. So in 1928, our old St. Henri's Church, the Cathedral of the Luxembourgers, became the chapel for Angel Guardian. A major expansion of the orphanage took place adjacent to it. So this is right in that era. They're breaking ground. There's St. Henri's, the nuns, the board from the orphanage. They're going to be building buildings right next to, on top of St. Henri's Church, and the parish got booted out. So this was the blessing of the cornerstone for the additional 5 orphanage buildings in May of 29. There you see St. Henri's, and they're adding on to it. And you can see in the background, there's still a smokestack from one of the greenhouses. But by 1929, wow, it's really urbanizing. This is a great rendering. It shows St. Henri's on the middle left, the 5 new buildings. Then you see closest to us on Devon, the old orphanage. You see in the upper right, the greenhouses. This gives you a sense. But at this point, this whole neighborhood is growing and growing with residential and business. It's quickly losing its rural character. There you see another aerial view from the mid-30s, about maybe 1938. St. Henri's is kind of in the middle right. You see the orphanage's buildings. You see some land that the orphanage had that they were still farming, some land, but boy, there's all sorts of apartment buildings and 3 flats, and this whole area is going now from rural to super urban. By 1940, Angel Guardian had helped over 10,000 orphans. In 1973, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services took a stance in favor of home placement, so foster care. The next year, that was the end. Angel Guardian ended caring for children. The following year, it was reorganized, and another group came in, Misericordia Home for Special Needs Children, opened. Today, it operates simply as Misericordia, and it supports children and adults with intellectual and developmental challenges. And as I showed you, they even have their own greenhouses yet, and their greenhouse cafe where you can eat, so there are remnants of the greenhouse tradition. What about the poor people of St. Henri's? In the fall of 29, Cardinal Mundelein blessed the new St. Henri's Church and School combination built on the far end of Angel Guardian's property on Hoyne Avenue. So they went from the Cathedral of the Luxembourgers to a combination school and church building. It was not easy. And some of St. Henri's parishioners, these Catholic Luxembourgers and Germanic people, left the Catholic Church because of the actions of Cardinal Mundelein. It was too much for them. Sadly, this year, 2020, this summer, St. Henri's has merged with neighboring parishes. So St. Henri's Parish on his own is really no longer. It existed for 169 years. Now, third hallmark, and we'll be finishing up, are the social clubs and the social events that were a hallmark too of Chicago Luxembourgers. As I shared with you, because of the Chicago fire, St. Michael's Luxembourgers in Old Town, they organized the Mutual Aid Society, and they almost lost everything because they had very little money at that time and paid out to help people. They reincorporated as a death benefit society. They were active. They had an annual ball and a summer picnic, but financially they were never solid, and they eventually folded. The next group, Luxembourg Independent Club, 1886. They were founded as a political voice after the Haymarket bombings, the famous labor bombings and shooting that went on. So people got very political dealing with labor issues in Chicago. So this group had a social focus, or had a reaction to it, a political focus, but they also were a social club. Interestingly, they had an area that was like their employers association to help new Luxembourg immigrants find work. And they also assisted people in their citizenship papers. But it was political, like our country, our world. So not after long, the conservatives and the liberals got into a fight, like within the first year, months. The club continued, but a more liberal faction broke off in the fall of 1887. The liberal faction, where do they go? Let's go to a saloon, because that's where you come up with your churches and your organizations, in a Luxembourg saloon. John Hankus, his saloon on Halstead. See the picture of John Hankus? It's hard to see his hand. He's got a stogie. I had to put it in there because that man had a saloon and his stogie. Nicholas Mersch recommended, hey, let's organize our own thing. Let's start on the south side. They went to the south side. So in October of 1887, they had the first organizational meeting, and our friend John Schmidt, who had a tavern as well, he presided. He was named interim president. On Christmas Day, the group got together. They adopted its constitutions and the name, the Luxembourger Bruderbund, the Luxembourger Brotherhood, a benevolent society. John Diederich was chosen as the first acting president. The Bruderbund quickly became the leading Luxembourg society in Chicago. In 1896, they decided to expand. They wanted to form, they were so successful. Let's do this in other parts of the city. Let's do this in Wisconsin. Let's do this in Iowa. Let's go other places. So they started forming sections. And the following year, the Grand Lodge of the Luxembourg Brotherhood was formed. So the Grand Lodge would have jurisdiction governance over all the various sections. Over the years, the Brotherhood had 25 sections: Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, even one with the Pennsylvania Luxembourgers. In 1902, they had enough members to qualify as an insurance organization, could pay sick and death benefits. They continued to be paying those benefits till 1990. The Brotherhood grew to be the largest, most successful, most enduring Luxembourg society in Chicago. In 1888, like year two, 28 members. In 1902, 500. At its height, 1,500 members. Those are some booklets, the constitutions, ritual, anniversary booklet from the Brotherhood. Here's some picture of these, the officers for these various sections. What characters. These are fantastic pictures. Here's a beneficiary certificate because, again, of the benefits that they paid out. Here they would have their lodge gathering or their conventions. This is at Niles Center, St. Peter's School, 1937. Not so long ago, the Brotherhood took in sisters, which was fantastic. And my friend Linda Hansen-Hines has the distinction not long ago of being the first woman Grand Lodge president. Boy, would her dad and grandfather be proud of her. And that's a picture of the LBA convention in 2018. So the LBA is still going strong. Now, we're talking about Wilmette. Grosse Pointe Wilmette had their own Section 21, founded in 1907. I was just with the Wilmette Historical Society folks a couple of weeks ago. They have got all the archival material from Section 21, which I was able to see. You could view if you make an appointment sometime and meet with them. Awesome stuff. They have the list of the charter members of Section 21. They have the minutes from the first 1907 meeting. This is awesome stuff. The best thing they have, which is awesome, is the original membership book from Section 21. List the members, their birthplace, like he was born in Eschdorf, Luxembourg. What's his career, his occupation? Gardener. Who's his wife? When did he join? Blah, blah, blah. You see 2 scratched out. They didn't pay their dues often enough, so they just scratched them out. This is a fantastic resource if you have ancestors from Grosse Pointe or Wilmette. The Luxembourg American Cultural Society was the recipient of the archives from the Grand Lodge. So the Cultural Center has some of these ledgers, and from the Aurora section, they received that. So if you get to the Cultural Center, see if they have these ledgers from maybe a community where you have ancestors from. Also at the Wilmette Historical Society, a treasure that they have is the 1916 LBA banner. So the Luxembourg Brotherhood of America, Section 21, Grosse Pointe, there it is. There's some of the section members with it in 1978. All of those things got donated. Great place to the Wilmette Historical Society. A little bit more. In 1980, the LBA, Section 21 from Wilmette, in this junction area here of New Glenview Road and Wilmette, there was this unkept kind of gardening area on this big intersection. So in 1980, there's a picture. It's a great picture of the LBA Section 21 folks from Wilmette. They made it a memorial garden because some of them, like Hoffman's, are greenhouse people in memory of the founders of their section. And then the guys, that's a picture of them at a bar, because after you have your business meeting, you're Luxembourgers, you got a drink. In 1904, LBA Section 3, which is Rogers Park, began the Brotherhood's famous Schobermesse, the fall festival. Schobermesse is based on the ancient Schoberfeuer festival in Luxembourg, begun by St. John the Blind. Schobermesse is the German word. Schoberfeuer is the Luxembourg word. There you see a picture, early picture of the committee. These guys knew how to have fun. So this was a promotional picture for the Schobermesse. Look at the guy in the bottom right corner, big stone thing on his head, a guy with a mallet above him. I'm sure there was drinking involved, but this is an early Schobermesse Section 3 organizational committee. Originally, the Schobermesse was held Labor Day weekend at Carthauser's Picnic Grove and Ebert's, right on Ridge Ave. They're right next to each other near St. Henri's. They needed 2 picnic groves. This was Luxembourgers, a lot of people. Carthausers are Luxembourgers, Eberts are German from just over the border. So they were at these picnic groves with the saloons right there. Produce and flower competitions were held because these were the greenhouse people. So it was like the county fair. You brought your produce, your flowers. There were competitions, judging, prizes, of course. You can read in the Luxembourger Gazette the list of the winners at the early Schobermesses, who had the best pickles and who had the best roses. It's awesome. They had music and dancing, games. They had sack racing, goat riding, egg treading, weightlifting, merry-go-round. And then this photograph, I have this postcard, greased pole climbing for valuable prizes. So you had to climb the greased pole because up on top, hanging there, were some valuable prizes, probably bottles of booze. Participants originally brought their own food. So that was like picnic, okay? And the 2 picnic groves, Carthausers and Eberts, they made good money selling the beverages. Elaborate Schobermesse programs were published each year, originally in German and in English. The Luxembourg American Cultural Society has the entire series of Schobermesse programs. They are a gold mine of information for genealogists, historians, family tree people. They're just a gold mine of information. The advertisements that they had to raise money for the book and the Schobermesse are priceless for genealogy. So again, all of these are available at the Luxembourg American Cultural Center. They had parades, and these are some historic pictures of parades. They would decorate their floats. The girls on the top have different flags from various cantons of Luxembourg. So parades and all sorts of, you didn't have to be a Luxembourger to come to the Schobermesse. If you lived in that region, you were a part of it. The Schobermesse flourished until its demise with the 60s, changing world, changing stuff in 1967. But in 2001, a very enthusiastic group of Luxembourg Brotherhood members resurrected it, and the Schobermesse continues today. If you've not experienced it, you've got to check it out. The Brotherhood has also published the Luxembourg News of America since 1926. If you don't subscribe, you should be subscribing. It's a very affordable monthly periodical, and it's awesome. The Luxembourg Brotherhood of America is the only Chicago-based Luxembourg society still in existence. Visit their website, luxembourgbrotherhood.org. What were some of the other groups? We got to get the women folk. They're not going to let the men stand you up, and the women would end up doing a lot of the work, I suppose, anyway. So we have the Luxembourg Ladies Society of the North Side, their medallion from 1904. That is two sides of one medallion. The reddish one was worn at your meetings, but when you went to a funeral, you pulled the pin out, reversed it, and wore black, of course, for the funeral. So that's two sides of one membership pin. And there's the Luxembourger Schwesterverein in Chicago, 1906. We saw the Music Verein, that's another picture, in front of the original St. Henri's Church, which was a storefront for many years. The Sangerbund, which was the singing society. They sang at Luxembourg events, they sang at competitions, ethnic competitions. They were a very, very strong society, the Luxembourger Singing Society of Chicago. This is my favorite group, the Luxembourg Theater Troupe. They had their own actors. And this is a picture of a play they put on in 1906. The Brotherhood had a Luxembourger National Fest, but they performed at all sorts of Luxembourg functions, at competitions, at church things. So the Luxembourger Theater Troupe did in fact exist. The Luxembourg Youth Organization did many, many different things. This is a softball team in 1937, so even the young people were involved. The Luxembourg Bowling League, here's a picture of them in 1939. So the Luxembourgers in Chicago, with their huge population, these social groups were a significant hallmark of identity, Luxembourgers in Chicago. A later club, the Luxembourg American Social Club, very involved. Many people maybe listening were a part of that or had relatives. This group in 1963 was the Millennium of Luxembourg. Luxembourg was founded 963, so 1,000 years later, the Luxembourg American Social Club of Chicago organized this group of Americans, most from Chicago, some from Wisconsin, who I knew, some from other parts of the country, about 180 people, I guess, went to Luxembourg. They rolled out the red carpet for them in Luxembourg so that they could be there for the 1,000th anniversary of their homeland. That's a picture on the steps of the Hotel de Ville City Hall, Luxembourg City. All right, I'm going to finish up. Sorry it's gone so long, but here we go. Here are some Luxembourg heritage sites around Chicago. Some exist, some are no longer with us. Luxembourg Gardens was an institution in the 50s and into the 60s. Okay, it was a restaurant, social club, and picnic grounds on Lincoln Avenue in Morton Grove, right by Skokie. The Grand Lodge of LBA met in September of 1953. This building was originally Deckert's Hall and Picnic Grove in Morton Grove. They were Luxembourgers. Originally, they were off the Ridge, but they moved out, as many Ridge people did, to the suburbs. So the Deckert family owned this restaurant and picnic grove and were selling it. So the LBA got together in 1953 and thought, this is a great place for Luxembourgers and these societies to come together. So they had to raise money, so they sold shares. There were shareholders, Luxembourg Americans, who gave money to make this happen. They opened January 1st, 1954. Leo Aschett and his wife and Nick Colling, an immigrant, were managers over the years. This was the place where in 1964 they welcomed Grand Duchess Charlotte, Crown Prince, later Grand Duke Jean, were here. Unfortunately, because some financial things and stuff, it was sold in 1966 and was torn down for apartments. But Luxembourg Gardens was the party palace of the Luxembourgers in Chicago for that period of time. Here's two old postcards. They had big mural pictures of Luxembourg inside as their decor. There, Nick Colling and his wife are celebrating an anniversary. So it's a group of Chicago Luxembourgers partying at Luxembourg Gardens. The Bettendorf Castle is in Elk River Grove, Illinois, a suburb. In 1931, the guy in the picture, Teddy Bettendorf, came to Illinois. He was from Vianden, where the famous castle is. And he was enamored in the castle of his hometown. So he gets to Elk River Grove, and for the next 36 years, he built his Vianden castle by hand. He had a job in the city, took the train, but at night, weekends, especially in summer, worked his tail off, never married. This was his passion. The castle that he built by hand included a water-filled moat, wishing well, drawbridge, observation tower, courtyard. Following his death, it was used as a honeymoon suite. Many film things like commercials were made there. It was a private residence, but now it's the Bettendorf Castle. It's a venue for events. So that is a piece of Luxembourg heritage still standing in Metro Chicago. Teddy Majerus had a very famous restaurant, L'Aiglon, the Eaglet, that means, on Ontario, downtown Chicago. He was born in Luxembourg. As a young man, he went to Paris and London. He was trained as a caterer in some of the best cafes, went to New Orleans and learned about Creole cooking, was very involved at the famous La Louisiane restaurant, came to Chicago, managed another restaurant, set out on his own, and he specialized in French and Creole food in Chicago. It was high-end, hoity-toity. Teddy knew how to throw a party. On that picture, he's with Pearl Mesta, who was the first American ambassador to Luxembourg. All the rich and famous, all the Gold Coast Chicago celebrities, everyone knew Teddy, and that was the place to be. That, of course, is no longer. He's buried in Chicago with some of his siblings. Thillens Field. Okay. Mel Thillens was a son of Luxembourg greenhouse owners right on the ridge. He was the founder of Thillens Check Cashers, very successful check cashing company. He was an avid baseball player and fan. And he wanted to open his own little baseball field as his own little Wrigley Field on the north side for youngsters to enjoy. And that's what he did. He was a great benefactor, built up this place. The field was used for numerous fundraisers over the years, so it was a place for kids, Thillens Field. Unfortunately, over time, the Chicago Park District took over care and didn't keep it up to the family standards, so the name was removed. But this was Thillens Field, which was an institution for those of you living in that part of Chicago, located on Devon and Kedzie. Then we have this monument that's Section 3 of the Luxembourg Brotherhood, Rogers Park, Section 3, built in Memorial Park Cemetery in Skokie. They purchased numerous cemetery lots for their members who might be of lower income that could not afford their own cemetery plot. So this large monument is there. It's still standing. Many, many Luxembourgers are buried in Memorial Park Cemetery. And around the monument, of course, there's members of the Brotherhood are buried there. So that's another symbol and place of Luxembourg heritage in Skokie. There is the statue of Our Lady of Luxembourg at the Carmelite Cloistered Monastery in Des Plaines. In 1978, Bishop Hengen of Luxembourg gave the Chicago Luxembourg community a statue of Our Lady of Luxembourg, Mary, Consoler of the Afflicted, the patroness of the country. You see the statue in the cathedral in Luxembourg City, Notre Dame de Luxembourg, Our Lady of Luxembourg. Since the community no longer had its own building because the parishes had changed demographics really, the community decided to give the statue to the care of the cloistered Carmelite sisters in Des Plaines. So she's with the cloistered Carmelite nuns, which is a great home for her. But every year, the Luxembourg Brotherhood has an octave procession, just like they have in Luxembourg. Super cool to be a part of. So there's another piece of Luxembourg heritage in Chicago. You know, guys, you've been super patient. I've lost track of time. There is so much more to this story, but we're just out of time today. I'd love to tell you more about famous and some super infamous Luxembourgers in Chicago. There were some fascinating visits of the Grand Ducal family and other Luxembourg dignitaries to Chicago. I'd love to tell you about that sometime. That's material for another presentation, but definitely material for my book. So we have 300 people participating today. Can't take questions, and a lot is personal about families. If you have any questions, any corrections, because I'm not God's gift to Chicago Luxembourgers, any additional stories like, hey, I want to share this, any photographs, whatever, feel free, or if you want to be on a mailing list, because I want to do more Chicago presentations. So send me an email if you want to be on my emailing list to know other Luxembourgers in Chicago stuff coming up. But I am interested in your stories, your photographs, your memories for this book. And I'm looking for just about anything. And sometimes Sometimes people have a gem that they don't even realize is a gem. So I'd love to hear from you. Not necessarily all of you emailing or calling tonight or tomorrow or maybe the next couple of days, can spread it out a little bit, but feel free to be in contact with me if you have questions about Luxembourg dual citizenship or questions about my tours or whatever. Kevin.wester14@gmail, and there's my cell number. Leave a message if I don't answer, and I will definitely get back to you, but I'd love to hear from you. And also, I just created a new Facebook group called Luxembourgers in Chicago. It's for all of us. You can post your photos, your questions, your memories. When people send me questions, I will ask them, hey, could I post this on Facebook? So that way, you all might get information from questions you didn't send, but others did. I just think it'll be a great forum for connecting us and celebrating this rich, incredible, fascinating history of Luxembourgers in Chicago. I can just say, Eddie, that's the end, believe it or not. Thanks again, everybody, for attending, and thanks, Wilmette Historical Society.
Thank you so much. We have great questions to share with you as well. So I'll be passing those along. And I just want to say, if anyone loses Kevin's email address, just reach out to the museum. We can pass it on. And there's also going to be a recording that we will send along too. So thank you.
That was 2 hours, which is like a 3-credit class. Not that it applies to any degree, but you can say you now have 3 credits, history credits of Luxembourgers in Chicago.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was fabulous.